Joints of the human body are considered to be part of the skeletal system. This, of course, is where the bones that are definitely part of the skeletal system are all in contact with one another. Now, last week we looked at that blue handout that has a list of all the joints in the human body. We checked off the 10 that you need to know as part of the lower limb of the body. And so I did give you a little bit of information here related to this. So some of this will just be redundant, okay, but that's okay. Remember that joints or articulations, and we're going to use the word articulation from time to time. It's really the same word. It's just like a fancy word for a joint. Remember that these are the meeting places for two bones. People have a tendency when they think of joints to think that it's somewhere where the body is moving, but that is not the case. Movement does not need to take place there. And I think I pointed out the bones of the skull. You can see where they meet, and you can see that there are still lines there. They are distinctly separate bones. And yet we're going to call those places where they meet a joint. So you want to start. Make sure you've got that clearly set in your mind. Now, there are two basic classification systems. I'm not going to go into it a lot. One classifies joints by how much movement takes place there, either no movement, a little tiny bit of movement, or a lot of movement. And that's fine, but I prefer the anatomical classification. Okay, the anatomical classification is this, and you can see this outline in your blue handout, and you can see it here on this cream-colored outline that we're using for this lecture. And basically we're saying that the joints are defined by the tissues that hold the bones together. So if it's dense collagenous connective tissue, that's the only thing there holding the two bones together, then it's a fibrous joint. If cartilage is the only thing there holding the two bones together, then we're going to call it a cartilaginous joint. And the synovial joint is the term we use for a complex set of tissues that holds two bones together but allows them the freedom to move. So this category is really the same no matter which pattern of categorization you use. It's just the other two that are really a little bit different. So fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial, the three classifications of joints. Now within each of these there are subtypes, and you need to know what those types are, and you need to be able to give me an example of those. So let's go through each one and talk about the subtypes here. Okay, in the fibrous joints, dense collagenous tissue, the first one there is a syndesmosis. Syndesmosis is basically a fibrous type joint where you have sheets or cords that are holding the two bones together. The picture here shows you the two bones of your forearm. Just like your leg has two bones in it, your forearm does. And in fact, the pattern is the same. The two bones kind of operate as one because you can see from one end of the bone to the other, the two bones are locked together with sheets and cords of connective tissue. This is the example of a syndesmosis. Now, since we don't know the names of these two bones together, the one that we're going to use as an example is the joint we call the tibiofibular joint. So you could imagine, imagine that the tibia and the fibula were in this picture, and that you can see the tissues right from one end to the other. Okay, you can see that the tibia and the fibula, that gap between the two of them has sheets of connective tissue in there. So that is a good example of what a syndesmosis is. The second fibrous type joint is the suture. Sutures are found in the skull, and they are the tiny little gaps here between the bones. Many of the bones in the skull are flat bones, and so they meet along their edges, and you can see that the bones interweave themselves together. We say interdigitate, kind of the concept of putting your fingers together like so, and creating a weaving together, but there still is a gap there. It's a microscopic gap, if you will, and down in that little space there are these little collagenous fibers down there holding the edges of the bones together. So it's tiny little fibers down in these little gaps between the bones holding them together. Now, let me take you just a little bit farther than that. Do you remember the name of the membrane that is covering the surface of any and all bones? Periosteum. Remember that? Now just imagine for a minute that I've got this, but then I've got a periosteum over each bone, right? And what you would see here is the periosteum would just go right from one bone to the other. It would be a continuous thing right here. So I've got this continuous periosteum kind of creating a leotard around the entire skull right here. But then down in the little gaps, you'd find the little microscopic fibers holding the edges together and keeping the bones actually separate from one another. Okay? You want to begin to get this bigger and bigger picture of how the connective tissues weave and tie the entire skeleton together. Connective tissues are really at the heart of that. And you'll see that in other ways as we move along here.
Like when the child, before the bones have grown together, is it the periosteum that's holding the skull?
The periosteum is really keeping things together. Say, in a very young child, year-old child, has got a soft spot right here, right? A fontanelle where the edges of the bone are still growing together and still ossifying. But there's a periosteum over the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's the suture. The third type of fibrous joint is the gomphosis. And basically the only place we find this is where the teeth are attached into the jaw. I don't know about you, but I don't know if you ever thought about it. Do you ever think about how your teeth are attached into your jaws? You know, the teeth obviously fit down in little sockets in the jaw bones. Well, they're actually roped in, right? The root of the tooth and the bone itself are tied to one another by connective tissues, what we call periodontal ligaments. They're not cemented in. If you grab a tooth and push it a little bit, most teeth in your mouth will wiggle a slight amount. Will wiggle a little bit. And that's because there is tiny little bits of flexibility here. You really know this is going on when you think of a child who's about to lose a tooth, right? When the tooth is growing up the new tooth is growing up from below, the roots of the tooth dissolve and usually wind up with just like a little chunk of a tooth, right? When a kid's tooth falls out. But just before it does, you usually say, oh, that tooth is just hanging on by a thread. Sure it is, right? And it'll wiggle and wobble, and there's a little bit of thread holding that tooth. Well, actually the entire tooth was roped or threaded into the jaw. So teeth are not really bones. They're not osseous tissue. We don't have compact or cancellous bone here, but we consider them to be part of the skeletal system. And we really don't have time here to go into their entire structure, so we're not going to do that. But the teeth are considered to be part of the skeletal system, and so we're going to call this a joint. And it's one of the three types of fibrous joints in the human body. Okay? Everybody good with that? Okay, so three types of fibrous joints, two types of cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joint, I've got two bones that meet, and there's just a piece of cartilage between the two. The two types of joints are defined by the type of cartilage. You know there's 3 types of cartilage. There are no elastic cartilage type joints. There's no elastic cartilage found in a joint. But the synchondrosis is hyaline cartilage. Great example of that would be here in the rib cage. Imagine, again, can you imagine that there's a periosteum here that just runs right over the surface of the cartilage and then right onto the breastbone? Just imagine everything here covered with connective tissues over the surfaces. Technically, when it covers a piece of cartilage, we call it the perichondrium instead of the periosteum. And by now, if you've been paying attention, you probably have noticed that that word chondro shows up again and again and again when we're talking about cartilage. Going forward, this is very useful. You're in a situation, somebody says some word that you've never heard before, but you hear chondro in the middle of the word. Boom, you know that word has something to do with cartilage. Right? Osteo, bone, chondro, cartilage. So this is a synchondrosis, right, with cartilage. It happens to be hyaline. This is also the cartilage of the growth plates. I don't want to get so technical that I think of these as joints. Some people do. Most textbooks will do that. You say, oh, in a child's bone, you've really got one bone is really 3 bones. And the cartilage here really is a joint between the 2 pieces of bone. Technically, that's probably right. Practically, that's kind of out on the edge, I think. But technically, it's right, I guess. We're not going to use that. We'll use like the rib cage as a good example of a synchondrosis here. The other one, the other type is the symphysis, fibrocartilage, and we do have an example here in the lower limb. The pubic joint is our one cartilaginous joint for the lower limb. And so this little pad between the 2 pubic bones is a piece of fibrocartilage. Very tough stuff. And we've used this one before. In fact, this was on the test, wasn't it? Right? Fibrocartilage is found where? Right? Between the vertebra. The intervertebral discs are fibrocartilage. So there are a number of fibrocartilage type joints, the ones we call a symphysis. This would be the pubic symphysis. This would be the intervertebral symphysis. In fact, that just brings to mind one of those little bits of a word that you must know. The word inter, I-N-T-E-R, inter. What does that word mean? Okay. How many think it means inside of something? No, okay? Typically, when people hear that, the first thing they think is inside. It does not. It means between. Okay? Inter means between. So if I say intervertebral, what do I mean? Between 2 vertebrae, right? If I say intercondylar, I mean between 2 condyles. I'm looking for something between the 2 condyles. If I say intertrochanteric, I mean something in between the 2 trochanters. There's a greater trochanter and a lesser trochanter. I mean something between those 2. So there's a crest running between the 2 on the posterior side, and there's an intertrochanteric line running between the 2 on the anterior side of the bone. So you're going to hear the word inter all over the place throughout human anatomy. You must think between 2 things. Okay. So there are all of our cartilaginous and our fibrous joints. Okay? So in our handout here, we've just described examples of each one of these, and we've given you some places where you could locate those. Right? You want to make sure you know those. Okay, now let's talk about synovial joints. Now, this is a much trickier thing. These other type of joints, you just anchor the parts of the bones together with a piece of fiber or cartilage. Here, I've got to hold 2 bones tightly together and yet give them the freedom of movement. That's a much, much trickier thing. And typically, it involves a joint capsule, okay, a pocket type structure, and some fluid to lubricate that. So let's look at synovial joints in more detail. Okay, these joints are going to have this complex set of tissues. There's going to be a lining tissue in this. There's going to be connective tissues. Do you know the word capsule? Kind of like a space capsule? Right? It's kind of like a chamber, isn't it? It's going to be a chamber of some kind surrounding the joint. And it's going to be lubricated with what we call synovial fluid, related to the fact that these are synovial joints. When you take notes here, don't try and write down every single word, okay? Some people I see, they're trying to copy it's kind of like you give somebody a highlighter in a textbook and the whole book's yellow, you know. You're trying to just find significant words, important little pieces, put things in your own words so they mean more to you. Let's look at a representative synovial joint. Let's look at a picture of a typical sort of synovial joint. This is the one that your textbook uses, so you've got a copy of this. You can look at it later. Notice that I've got two bones here that meet, right? They're touching one another. And if you look closely, you can see that there is kind of a capsule structure, kind of a pocket or a chamber surrounding these places where the bones meet. You should know, too, that sometimes this picture shows up on the test. See if you know the structure, if you can know and label the structure of this. So let's talk about the elements. You can see the elements listed there. See if we can describe the elements here. Number one would be the fact that the two bones where they touch are covered with cartilage. And anywhere they are going to rub against one another, there's going to be cartilage. The rest of this can be bone, but where they touch and rub is cartilage. What type of cartilage? What? Hyaline cartilage, exactly. The smoothest type, the one with the least amount of fiber in it. Enough fiber to just give it a consistency, but not very much. The cartilage here is slick and smooth, right? The thing that we want here is no friction if possible. We don't want any rubbing as much as possible. So the ends of the bones are always covered with articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is kind of a functional description. What it is hyaline cartilage. It's kind of like saying, who am I? I'm a human being, or I'm David, that's who I am. But you could also describe me as a college instructor. That's what I do. Right? Two different ways to describe me. I can describe this as hyaline cartilage, what it is, or articular cartilage, what it does. Because there are other bits of hyaline cartilage throughout the body, like the hyaline in your nose. That is not articular cartilage. It's not a part of a joint. Okay, so first and foremost, any bone that's going to touch in a synovial joint is covered with cartilage. Secondly, we have this capsule. Okay, and the capsule is going to have two layers to it. Two layers to it. The outermost layer is known as the fibrous capsule. So what's it made out of? Fibers. What kind of fibers? Collagen fibers. Strong, dense, irregularly woven sheets of very tough stuff. Think of the skin again. Just think of that layer of tough, dense connective tissue. Think of the periosteum. In fact, let's take our picture a little bit farther as we picture the skeletal system. Picture this. The periosteum here. You following me? Picture the periosteum. When I get here to the cartilage, the periosteum comes away from the surface of the bone, crosses the gap, and becomes the periosteum of the next bone, isn't it? The periosteum of each bone and the fibrous capsule are continuous. It's almost as if you put the two bones in a sleeve, right? The connective tissue doesn't like go and stop and then start again and then stop. It's all one big continuous bit of connective tissue. It's almost like you put the whole skeleton in a jumpsuit, right? You know, one of those suits that has the legs and the arms, or, you know, like the kids' pajamas, right? That are complete and whole. Every bit of skeleton is covered with connective tissue, and every gap between the bones, every space between bones is covered with connective tissue. There's connective tissue everywhere. And it just happens that periosteum becomes fibrous capsule, becomes periosteum, becomes fibrous capsule at the next joint, and periosteum. It's one big continuous sheet of connective tissue. Right. If you're pointing to this layer here, you want to describe this as the fibrous capsule. Yeah. Now, just inside that is the second layer, which is called the synovial membrane. Now, the synovial membrane then lines everything inside the capsule except the cartilage. So there are places where the synovial membrane, if the periosteum is away from the surface of the bone, if there's a gap here between the periosteum and the bone, the fibrous, the synovial membrane will come over and actually cover the side of the bone. Okay? The synovial membrane is an epithelial type tissue. It's got a surface to it, right? It's going to have a basement membrane that holds it to the fibrous capsule. But there's a gap, there's spaces, right? So this blue, they've colored it blue in the picture. This here is the synovial membrane. Synovial membrane is very slick. And what that does then is every surface inside the capsule is slick. The cartilage is slick, the synovial membrane is slick. The other thing with the synovial membrane is the cells produce synovial fluid. So the membrane is producing a fluid that occupies the little spaces here between the structures. And that fluid it's kind of like soap. It's very slick, very slippery. The joint is self-lubricating. The joint provides its own lubrication. So I've got what I would consider to be a cavity, an empty space here in and around. There's space between the two bones. There's spaces in here. The one thing that you want to think, though, is the spaces do not look like this. The artist has drawn this picture with big, wide spaces between the structures so that you can see them more clearly. In real life, everything in here is very snug, right? This thing that is bulged out to the side is snug and right up against this. The membrane doesn't have to produce a lot of fluid, just enough to fill the little tiny gaps between the structures. So your joints, under normal operating conditions, all the tissues are very snug and tight, very slippery, right? You know, even after as many years as I've been around, you know, you can move your joints and there's no friction there. You know, you move an elbow and it just moves smoothly. Now, in some diseases like arthritis, if the cartilage begins to wear away, you can start getting a gritty surface there that is not frictionless. And then that grittiness can wear away more and more. You can work this right down to the bone, and then people just don't want to move their joints because you're grating bone on bone. The other thing, too, is sometimes people will sprain a joint, like you sprain an ankle. What typically happens when you sprain a joint? Does it swell up? It swells up, exactly. There's rich blood supply here constantly feeding this epithelial tissue here, right? And anytime the synovial membrane gets irritated, it just starts pumping out more fluid to try and push things away from itself and protect itself. And typically what happens then is that the capsule can swell up with fluid and become balloon-like. There's no way out, so it literally fills up like a balloon. And that's kind of what this joint looks like, one that's been damaged and is swollen. In athletic injuries where these things so often happen, you're constantly using things to try and decrease the swelling. Sometimes the production of synovial fluid or bleeding into this space, the swelling will produce more injury than the actual injury produced in the first place. So you always try and minimize the swelling in a joint. But it's just a natural consequence of disrupting the synovial membrane. Now, no matter which type of synovial joint you're talking about, and if you looked at your list, you could see there are 6 types. They all have these elements. They all have cartilage where the bones touch. They all have a capsule-like structure with a synovial membrane producing fluid, so the surfaces are all slick and rubbed together with no friction. All right, so you want to make sure that you could label all the various structures that you see here. There are a couple of other sort of side elements that we sometimes find associated with synovial joints. Okay, so let me just go back for a minute and make sure that we got interrupted here for a second, but let me go back. Okay, so what we're talking about is a bursa being a piece of synovial membrane that migrates away from the main structure of the joint and is really providing protection from something rubbing against the side of the bone or some other structure that's in and around, sometimes slightly removed from the joint itself, but providing some other kind of protection from friction in and around or near the joint. The other way that sometimes synovial membranes migrate a little bit is in a structure called hang on. I'm not getting to that yet. Here's an example. I forgot I'd put this picture in here. Here's a picture of the bursa. Here's the shoulder. You can see all of these bits of connective tissue holding the humerus into the shoulder blade. And if we saw the capsule in here, you'd see the synovial membrane. But if you look right up here, between the bone that's above the humerus here, this little white area right here represents a bit of synovial membrane and connective tissue that pouches out and protects this superior part of the humerus from bumping up and rubbing against this. This is a bursa right here that's protecting that. And yeah. So this is a real life example other than that other picture that we have there. Right, the main joint capsule would be here, and the bursa then is out to the side. Okay, so should know what a bursa is. Now the second one that you want to know is what's called a tendon sheath. And this is where the connective tissue and the synovial membrane form sort of a sleeve around a tendon. Tendons are the connective tissues that attach muscles to bones. And again, sometimes that tendon is placed in such a way that it would rub against the side of a bone. In that case, the synovial membrane may make a little bit of a sleeve around the tendon. An example of this from a real life perspective is what you see right here. Here's the main capsule here. This is again that shoulder area. And here's a tendon. Actually this is one of the tendons of your biceps muscle. And that tendon runs right up in a groove on the humerus here and up into the shoulder. And there's a sleeve because it's running right along the side of the bone and kind of curving over the side of the bone. there's a sleeve or a tendon sheath surrounding that, protecting that. Pardon me. So, this is the picture as it looks in your book with all the different parts labeled. Notice a bursa and a tendon sheath labeled in the picture. So, make sure you know these basic elements of the synovial joint and those two accessory structures that may or may not be present. Typically only present in the more complicated areas where you've got a lot of muscle and joint and bone and many, many things going on, like the shoulder would. Okay? So that's a synovial joint. Now the synovial joint has 6 types. So let's look at and describe the 6 types of synovial joints. We know they all have the features we just described in common, but how do they differ? Well, each one is going to differ on the basis of the shapes of the bones where they meet, where they touch. So each will have a surface that allows for a certain range of motion. They're all going to be different by the placement of the various ligaments that restrict movement. And so we wind up with 6 synovial joints, each shaped slightly different. So let's describe those shapes and how each one can allow the movement that it does. So, 6 types. Let's first describe the pivot joint. Okay, the pivot joint allows for a movement that we call rotation. Now, we dealt with this. We will deal with rotation in the next lecture as we talk about movements, but it's fairly easy to understand here. It's an action where something spins on its axis. It does not move in space. It doesn't move from one location to another. It stays where it is and simply spins or rotates. This requires bone surfaces that will allow one bone to rotate against another. When we actually talk about movements, this one will become a little more apparent. We call this a monoaxial joint because it has one ability of motion. In other words, it just moves in one way. And this bone, this joint, is going to allow for a rotating motion, and that's all. No other types of movement will take place here typically. These are fairly rare in the human body. The 2 places that we would describe them would be in the forearm, and if you just hold your arm out straight in front of you, palm up, notice that without any movement at your elbow, you can rotate your forearm, turning your hand palm down and palm up. So in the forearm, we have a pivot joint, and the other would be at the base of the skull in your neck, which allows your skull quite a bit of rotation around the neck, whereas rotation through the rest of your torso takes place with a multitude of cartilaginous joints. So, pivot joint, monoaxial, located at the forearm or the neck. Now, second monoaxial joint is the hinge joint. These are fairly common around the body. As I said, these are also monoaxial, just one motion allowed here, and it is a hinging motion like a door. The door on the classroom here, the door on your bedroom has got typically several hinges that allow it to swing. And that's all it does. Your door doesn't go up and down. It doesn't go side to side. It doesn't spin around like a revolving door. It simply swings on a hinge. Your knee or your elbow would be good examples of this. Your toes or your fingers. But if you think about your knee particularly, you know that it bends and straightens. That's all it does. It doesn't move side to side. There's no rotation at your knee. The surfaces here are usually wide, and the two surfaces are going to allow a hinging type of action. The other monoaxial joint is the one here at the bottom of the list called the plane joint. This is a joint that is typically described with two flat or semi-flat surfaces that simply slide or glide over one another. Often the movement takes place in several directions, but it's simply one kind of motion, a simple sliding motion. The joints between the tarsals of the foot are a good example of this. You've learned the names of the tarsals by now, and each of them is a short bone or a blocky bone. They don't have a lot of movement here, but the bones can slip and slide on one another to allow the foot a certain degree of flexibility to contour it to various surfaces that it might be walking on. So plane joints are flat or semi-flat surfaces. So there are three monoaxial joints in our list. The saddle joint, the third one on your list, is considered to be a biaxial joint. And what does this mean? Well, bi, like two wheels on a bicycle. The biaxial motion takes place prominently in two directions. Now, if you press this a little bit, you can combine some of those twos and get a greater degree of movement, but the shape of the two bones allows for two prominent motions. And if you look at the shape of the bone here, if you pulled those two apart that you see in the picture, you would see that each bone has the shape of a Western riding saddle, the part of the saddle that you would sit on. And two saddles don't fit very well together if they're in the same straight orientation, but if you turn one of the saddles sideways and lay it on the other, the two saddles fit very nicely together. And you can see that these bones could slip and slide in two prominent directions. The upper bone could slide side to side, or it could slide forward and back. These joints, the saddle joints, are pretty rare in the human body. The only one that we're going to pay attention to, and it won't be in the lower limb unit, will be the joint at the base of the thumb. The joint at the base of the thumb, where it anchors into the bones of the wrist, is called a saddle joint. And this allows the thumb to do something that the rest of the fingers cannot do. The other fingers simply hinge, they bend forward and back. The thumb, though, is capable of swinging into the palm of the hand and opposing or being used with each of the fingers. Touch with your hand, your thumb, to each of the fingers in your hand. And you can see that. You can touch the tip of your thumb to the tip of each of your fingers. You and I and just several species of apes are the only animals with what we call an opposable thumb. Your cat or your dog has a thumb digit, but it only works like a finger. It just simply hinges. But our thumb makes our hand a tool-using hand. We can use our hand then to grasp things effectively between our thumb and our fingers. And all of this is because of the joint there at the base of the thumb that allows it to swing into the palm of your hand and be used with your fingers. So this may be the one joint in the human body that helps make you most human. Your ability to use tools with that, your hand, and with that joint. So just one location for this saddle joint that we're going to study, and that's at the base of the thumb. Now there is one other biaxial joint, and it's this fourth one on the list, the ellipsoid joint. An ellipse in mathematics is the name that is used for an oval shape, and the ellipsoid joint, as you can see, has two bone surfaces that have an oval shape to them. One is concave, one is convex, so they fit into one another, but they allow not only a hinging type action, but the bones can actually slide side to side. There's less range of motion one way or the other, but it is prominently a biaxial joint. You can combine the two motions to get somewhat greater degree of flexibility, but it's primarily biaxial. A good example of this, I don't like the example in this picture of the base of the skull, but a good example would be at the knuckles of your hand, and this would be true for the joints at the base of your toes. But if you think for a moment about where your fingers join your hand, your whole finger can bend forward or back. It can flex or extend at your knuckles at the point where the fingers touch the hand. But they can also do something else. If you hold your hand up, you'll find that you can spread your fingers sideways. They can move side to side as well as forward and back. That side to side motion is the second part of that ability at the biaxial joint, at this ellipsoid joint. So, think about the same thing at your toes, where your toes meet the body of your foot. Not only can you curl your toes or straighten your toes, but you can actually move your toes sideways. So, the ellipsoid joint allows for this biaxial motion. The last of the joints, the sixth category here, fifth in your list, is the ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint is what we call a multi-axial joint. Many movements, many different directions. And here shows the shoulder joint in the lower limb. Same thing would be for the hip joint, the coxal joint, and the head of the femur fitting into the bone called the acetabulum allows for a very, very large range of motion. So, good example for us would be the hip. Shoulder is good as well, but obviously the ball end of one bone fitting into the socket on the other. So there are your six categories. The three monoaxial joints, the pivot, hinge, and plane, the saddle joint and the ellipsoid that are biaxial, and the ball and socket. Make sure that you know these ranges of motion and could give an example of a location for each one of these types. In our next lecture, we'll be talking about movements of the joints and giving you some language to actually describe in more detail what's going on at each of these synovial joints. So, study well.